Okay, it's live. We're live.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Apologies for that, brothers. It honestly was not me. Yeah, so I did not touch anything, and none of the brothers knows exactly what happened. Perhaps the topic is too hot, and we got cancelled from our end. So we're not 200% sure exactly what happened, but it wasn't from our end. We didn't touch any buttons and cancelled it by mistake or anything like that. So, but khair, inshallah, we're back again. Unfortunately, we've had to set up a new stream for this because that one got cancelled. Hopefully, everybody can come back again. Uh, so I've got this. I've got to respond to this because obviously Sharif pressed the wrong button. No, I didn't touch anything. Honestly, wallah. So, but alhamdulillah. Anyway, we're back now. So the point that I was making beforehand was the reason why I was critical of Qatar getting the World Cup, and it had nothing to do with the criticisms the West had. The criticism that I had was the fact that you're spending $220 billion or pounds. I can't remember. I think it was $220 billion, and this is a waste of money. And it's not the fact that Qatar, is living the high life, and that's fine. It's the fact that the wealth of Qatar comes from gas, and gas, from a Shari Islamic perspective, is considered the Ummah's wealth. It's the property of the people. It's not property of an individual family or corporation. It cannot be privately owned. And so therefore it's a obligation for that type of wealth to be utilized for the people. So if you've got one part of the Muslim world that's facing, starvation or poverty, breakdown in infrastructure or flooding or whatever it is, then this is where this money needs to be used. And so this is why, I was critical against it. But this is completely different to what I think Brother Jake and Brother Abdullah have mentioned in terms of the fact that there is an inconsistent basis the West is holding. And the inconsistent basis the West is holding is the fact that they are, at the one hand, claiming Qatar does not have the right to hold this World Cup, but yet, and they cite various examples of this, of human rights abuses, but yet, Beijing Olympics or, Rio de Janeiro and Brazil, when they held the World Cup and there were demonstrations outside the opening ceremony of the stadium, or Russia in 2018, there was barely any discussion around any of these types of these countries or venues. But with regards to the Muslims, they have. Now, I was going to ask Abdullah. I know Abdullah's sort of, I think he's gone off screen for a little bit. But I was going to ask the question to Abdullah, which was, why specifically Qatar is raising this issue? This issue is being raised about them? Why wasn't it raised about, Russia? Because Russia, okay, it's an enemy of the West, quote unquote, yeah, or China, but they don't seem to raise it in the same way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the answer is relatively obvious. Is that these are Muslim countries and they have issues with Islam. Russia, despite all the things which there are many issues that the West raise against Russia, Russia is ostensibly secular, and so for the West, they're more palatable than countries or states which are more influenced by religion or Islamic law, rather than those which are completely secular and devoid of that. So that, I think, is one of the primary triggers amongst them, because obviously then Qatar has laws against sodomy, and LGBT is something that they raise, even though Russia has some restrictions against what they call gay marriage and things like this, but it doesn't ban sodomy done in private or just sodomy, generally speaking. So there's the issue that they'll have a double standards when it comes to a secular regime versus a regime which is secular but more influenced by religion or Islam. Of course, these regimes in the Muslim world, as I said on the show, they are secular, but they have a kind of conservative element where they want to conserve some of the laws that were just a few or some influences, laws that were pre-colonialism. Although, as we know, in many countries, conservatives will eventually allow some laws to change over time, which is why Saudi Arabia, for example, is liberalizing. As they conservatives are just slower liberals, right? They eventually relax the laws that they were initially conserving, because they believe that laws are only necessary for social stability, not because they must be implemented because of divine will. Necessarily, most conservatives are not that bent. Anyway, my point being is that it's a Muslim country. Islam has some influence in Qatar. They have an issue with that, and so they will come down hard upon Qatar, but they will not apply the same standards to countries that have killed millions of people, have done worse atrocities than simply migrant workers dying. Migrant workers die in the UK, by the way. At least in the last year, there was, just in the last year alone, there was about 100, 200 migrant workers, construction workers dying on building sites. Building sites are dangerous, and it's deemed to be just a normal thing that happens. It's a horrific thing, but it's a normal thing. But when migrant workers die in Qatar, all that's due to human rights abuses and so on and so forth. I mean, they should really see how migrants are treated in France or Germany or such places.
Well, not just that, but also, Abdullah, the fact was that just a couple of weeks before the Qatar World Cup, there was a terrorist attack against a migrant centre in the UK. Yeah, so somebody who threw petrol bombs at the centre, and also a week before the World Cup in Qatar, there was criticisms against the government, who had basically increased they basically had overcapacity of migrants living at this migrant center where they were being processed. And as a result of this, there was diseases that were spreading throughout that population. So they were living in unsanitary, unclean, disease-ridden, overhoused individuals within this area. This is in UK. Now, we don't hear anything, and this is by the way, this is the government's allowing this to occur. Not only that, but also people who come here and try to claim asylum, they end up getting shipped off to Rwanda as well. So that's a government policy now in the UK. Anybody that they see as a political asylum seeker or a legal immigrant or whatever, they end up being processed in Rwanda, and get sent there. So this whole idea that Qatar has this evil design against migrants or evil approach towards migrants, and the West have this enlightened approach towards migrants, seems complete joke, to be honest. Especially the fact that you hear every month or so migrant ships, people trying to come to the UK in boats, capsizing, dying, whether that's in the North Sea or the the France and Britain between what's it called again, the channel, between the two, or the Mediterranean, where they're trying to get to Spain or Italy or Greece. So you're hearing these situations occurring all the time with regards to the West, but yet they don't frame it that way, which is really interesting. So the English Channel, thank you.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's quite typical for them to ignore their own faults and, was it said, to look for the speck in their brother's eye, but ignore the log in their own eye, so to speak. Of course, but I do think it is excited by an Islamophobic intention, that they have this ingrained perception of the Muslim world being barbaric and horrific. In my kind of discussion I was having with the other panelists, Peter Tatchell, who is LGBT campaigner for many decades, he came up with this, what seems to be a ridiculous claim, that he said a gay man was taken out into the desert and beheaded, and a woman was stoned to death in Qatar as an honor killing. Now, Westerners will just believe that. I started to have doubts about it on the show. I think I think if you speak to other people, they might not say that, because I could tell it was anecdotal. He's getting it from some anecdote by some person. And how can you disprove it, right? You could just say, well, it could have happened. You don't know if everyone who's been taken out to the desert, right, and what's happened to them. But it was easily believed because of the trope that the Muslim world is barbaric and bloodthirsty and so on and so forth. I've been bombarded by messages from Qataris, many of them who actually took time out to research all kinds of news publications they could find, to speak to people that they know in libraries and hospitals and things like this, just to find out, has this ever occurred anywhere in Qatar? No one knows of it, right?
Yeah.
In Qatar. So that's the issue, is that whenever it comes to the Muslim world, that standard kind of Islamophobic trope, which we think only the right wing possess, the left wing possess too in abundance. So they're willing to assume the worst about the Muslim world. Hence, whenever a World Cup such event or other events are held in the Muslim world, you will see them come out with extreme umbrage against that, because they believe the same tropes that the right wing do. They just, unlike the right wing, they are not willing to say it's Muslims. They'll just say, oh, it's just a cultural practice or religion. But the right wing will come out with their hatred and say it is Muslims, it is Islam that's doing this.
So Jake, do you think also the fact that there's been this antagonism against Qatar hosting the World Cup, do you think there is a fundamental racist attitude, whether that's the left or the right, or do you think it's something different?
Towards why they have such animosity towards Qatar and them hosting? In particular,
I'm not saying it's a single reason, but I'm just saying generally that, there's an underlying racist attitude towards the Muslims.
I think it has to do with they just hate Islam. I mean, they see it as such a fundamental problem that they've been trying to get a hold on, or their grips on Muslims and Muslim countries and the religion of Islam for a long time now, right? So we see that in the past of the West trying to do these things, and Muslims, let's just be honest, they're just a little bit more difficult to deal with. They're not succumbing to as much of the pressure from the West as easily as some of these other countries and other religions like Christianity. I mean, Christianity has just given in to this whole thing. So yeah, I think it's fundamentally to do with the religion of Islam, and they see it as a war. And they've been trying to deal with it for a long time, and this is just a small example of that. I see all sorts of, not only with this issue with Qatar and the World Cup, I see all sorts of biases when it comes to Islam. Like even the secular leftists, right? They have a seems to me quite obvious, a special hatred for Islam and Islamic societies, or at least ones that are more conservative in their laws and their governments and things like that. As Abdullah mentioned earlier, of course, a lot of these countries have problems even with their own laws, but they still have some semblance of an Islamic structure or governance to them. And I have seen personally that secular leftists have much more of a special hatred and problem with Islamic run countries than anything else that I can see, whether it be like communism and China and even like certain Christian run governments. It just seems to me that Islam is like in its own sort of category, because it sees it as a different special type of threat to what their whole ultimate plan is and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, no, it reminds me actually of there's Samuel Huntington. He wrote a thesis called Clash of Civilizations, and in it he talked about how the West has this dominance around the world, but there are three key areas which are, at the moment, the obstacles for the complete domination of Western liberal secular values. He mentioned China, and to a certain extent, China adopts a capitalist ethos anyway. But the other people that he mentioned that form a stumbling block or an obstacle to the domination of Western capitalism was Islam and the Muslims. And that's because he said that Islam doesn't just represent a religion like Christianity, but rather Islam represents an ideology or way of life with its own economic, political, and social systems, as well as obviously rules related to the individual and how to pray and how to perform salah. So, I think they see Islam very uniquely, together with the fact that I think there is a racist attitude that people in the West have towards Muslims. They are told that they are barbaric and they're backward and they're this, that, and the other, and they treat women like this. And so therefore that just becomes inculcated with them. So anything that comes out of Islam and the Muslim world, they can say whatever they want, and people, like Abdullah mentioned, will just believe it. But I wanted to raise this question that's been raised, or this issue, by Brother Adam, who says, I have lived in one of the Gulf countries, and issue of human rights, racism, it's a real issue. So I don't know, Abdullah, if you want to address that one.
Well, as I said on the program, we're not here to defend Qatar. We're here to advocate for Islam. And so if those two things don't align, then we go with the pathway of advocating for Islam, and we don't go with just defending Qatar for the sake of it, or any of these Gulf countries. There is a strong vein of what we call jahiliyyah, non-Islamic attitudes and sentiments in these countries. And of course, it's no surprise to see that there is attitudes towards migrant workers which are far, far below the standard that Islam expects of Muslims. There's also un-Islamic treatment of migrant workers in many of these countries, not giving them the housing that they require, that Islam requires any host to give to people who come to their lands. And so these are issues that we're not going to defend, but we're going to simply reiterate that Islam it gives rights to people who are migrants. It gives rights to Muslims and non-Muslims. And what we see, unfortunately, in the Muslim world is we're seeing a mentality born of non-Islamic mindset rather than an Islamic mindset. And our duty as Muslims is to advocate for revival of the Islamic mindset, sentiment, and law and society, inshallah, such that we can show the world Islamic rights, what they look like, as opposed to being berated by the West for their hypocritical and non-universal so-called rights, which they want to impose upon everybody else.
Yeah, I think the problem that this whole discussion has regards to Qatar is the West is attacking Qatar because they don't like the Islamic ethos, to be quite frank. Yeah. And Jake's mentioned it, and also you've mentioned it as well, Abdullah. And at the same time, the problem is that if you then criticize Qatar as a Muslim, then it comes across as, oh, you're siding with the West. The West are attacking them, and you should defend them, because by defending them, you're defending what is perceived as Islam. So I think the problem that we have is that Muslims start to feel as though they have to either be on the side of the West or the side of Qatar. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Jake. Whose side should we be on?
Yeah, no, and I just think it's a false dichotomy, right? So, like Abdullah just said, we're here to defend the Islamic position, right? And as classically understood, we're not here to defend either the hypocrisy of the West. We'll call that out where need be, and I think that Abdullah has been doing that, and he did that in the discussion with those other panelists. And so we're going to do that on the one hand, and on the other hand, just merely in virtue of that doesn't mean that we're now going to defend all of the policies and laws and international policies and behavior of the government of Qatar, nor do we have to defend the individuals and the individual citizens there and their treatment of migrant workers and whatever else is going on. We're not really, it's a false dichotomy as if we need to fully do one or the other of those things. No, we can point out the hypocrisy of the West while defend, and we're doing that because the reason and why, for the most part anyway, the West is so upset by Qatar hosting things like the World Cup is because they hate Islam. They hate Islamic values and things like that. That's for the most part, the real reason. And so we're going to defend the Islamic paradigm and call out the West for their hypocrisy in that regard. But at the same time, we're not, obligated at all to defend every single policy or aspect of places like Qatar's governance or anything like that, or for that matter, individual actions or behavior of people that live there. We don't have to do either one of those. We can call out both of those equally and say, no, actually the correct position is the Islamic position, right? And then if people want to understand what that is, we can offer an explanation of it and an attempt to defend it thoroughly. So that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, no, I think that's key, and I hope the Muslims and non-Muslims who are listening can appreciate this point, which is that we're both that you can be critical of Qatar and the fact that they are spending $220 billion for a World Cup, which could have gone to vitally to solve certain problems of poverty or infrastructure or the refugee crisis within the Muslim world. We can criticize the idea of nation statehood, particularly amongst the Muslim world where they've divided themselves. We can criticize Qatar for hosting the Western armed forces at Al-Udaid air base, which was used to launch attacks against Iraq and Afghanistan, which I think people have forgotten, to be honest, that Doha and Qatar was the main base. They moved the bases from Saudi Arabia to Qatar because Saudi was facing problems in terms of the fact that the backlash from the Muslims. And so they moved it to Doha and Qatar. So, and this is where it was launched to attack Iraq in 2003 and Afghanistan prior to that, and for many years afterwards. So we can criticize that, but at the same time, we can also defend the Islamic ethos that Qatar represents when it comes to the issue of banning of alcohol, the prohibition of, showing sexuality, whether that's heterosexuality or homosexuality publicly, or whether it comes to the issue of other aspects within Qatar lifestyle, which is from an Islamic ethos. We can defend them from that perspective, and we can defend the Islamic positions on that issue, and also demonstrate the hypocrisy of the West. So I think there's an issue also. Banning of alcohol in some areas. So I think somebody was raising this. Brother Jordan was saying banning of alcohol. That a lot they didn't. Well, they banned it in the stadiums, and therefore people were like up in arms and saying, "How can I watch football?"
Because they couldn't go there and get drunk. So I mean, God forbid they couldn't go to a game and sit there for a few hours without getting wasted. I mean, come on.
But
it's just ridiculous.
But yeah, they sort of banned it within the stadiums, but they had areas where they allowed people to drink alcohol and things like that. It's a bit schizophrenic. But anyway, so I think we can hold a position which is balanced, and I think as Muslims we need to hold this particular position as balanced. I think what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sharing the StreamYard. Oh, we have the StreamYard. Wicked, excellent. So we're going to share. We've shared the StreamYard link. We do want people who are any non-Muslims, liberals, maybe secularists, who think that Muslim world in general and Qatar in particular have issues with regards to their governance, so that we can debate and discuss this particular topic. If not, obviously we welcome Muslims as well for their comments and questions. Somebody's saying try reducing the gain on your mic. I'll try. I'll do that later. But just on this issue of the LGBT issue, actually, while we're waiting for guests to come on, I wanted to ask Abdullah about surely this LGBT issue, they are people who are oppressed, they're prohibited from expressing their identity in Qatar. Surely that's a wrong thing, is it not?
Well, the real issue is that basically we don't believe in the category of that humans can be divided into sexuality categories, right? That we don't believe in that. So if that's what we don't believe in, then why is there such a demand upon us to discriminate, and then they kind of attack us for discriminating, right? It's ridiculous, basically. So this is really the issue that we have to, the first premise we have to investigate. In the show, there was some discussion about this. They said they tried to misrepresent what I was trying to say and say that, oh, you're not accepting the existence of gay people. And I say, no, people have tastes. In Islam, everyone has sinful tastes of some kind, what have you. But we don't define people by tastes. We don't define people by taste, but we look into their choices. And people choose to engage in sinful actions, then the sinful actions are what it was prohibited. So some Muslims actually who had bought into this this post-colonial idea of heterosexuality, homosexuality as categories of people, then didn't, or maybe they usually make the mistake of then falling foul of Western discourse, when the West says to them, why do you discriminate against, not discriminate against, but why do you hate gay people? They're born that way. They are a people that exist. And when Muslims argue against it, not knowing how to differentiate between someone who has what we call same-sex attraction and someone who engages in sinful actions, then you see Muslims arguing that, like we have issues with gay people and so on and so forth, when it's not people who have same-sex attraction that we have issues with, right? And so then the Westerner hears you saying that people with same-sex attraction who can't help having that desire in them are somehow eternally damned merely for having same-sex attraction, something that they didn't choose. Of course, we know there's a hadith by the Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam which said that Allah, to paraphrase, that Allah has forgiven the whispers of people's whispers from their heart to them. He's forgiven them as long as they don't act on it, right? So we don't care about what sinful desires you have. We all have sinful desires. We vary in our, we don't all have the same sinful desires, but we have sinful desires. If a Muslim has an issue with drinking, with eating pork, we should be called now a porcophile or something. And what about the porcophile community? And we have to protect porcophile rights. And it's like, well, wait a second. We don't divide humanity into those categories in the first place, right? So that's the issue. And once you reject their first premise, then they can't make further imputations against us, because, for example, they'll say, why don't you accept equal marriage, so that gay marriage, people should be allowed to marry who they want? And I said, look, I even said in the debate, but the people were shouting or were trying to shout over me, but I think I kind of got it through. I said, I believe that everyone, regardless of their sexual tastes or preferences, everyone has the same equal right to get married. Islam believes that everyone has the same equal right to get married. Anyone can, who is an adult and mature and so on and so forth, can have the exact same right to marry a member of the opposite sex who is mature and so on and so forth, for the purposes of marriage and reproduction and so on and so forth and so forth. Everyone has the exact same right. Right? Everyone, man, woman, whatever age you are, whatever taste you have, everyone has the exact same right to marry a member of the opposite sex, right? Who's mature and so on and so forth. So we cannot, I produced the argument during the discussion, and they didn't respond to it because what they want to confuse you with, they want to give tastes equal rights, not people equal rights. So they say that the same-sex attraction taste is the same as the opposite sex attraction taste, and both those tastes deserve equal rights. I say, no, we don't look at tastes. We look at humans, and humans have equal rights as prescribed by the Creator, as in equal or commensurate. And we all, a person who's a homosexual and a heterosexual, they both have the same right in Islam to get married to a member of the opposite sex for the purpose of reproduction, legal protections for the kids, and so on and so forth. So if you deny that first premise, that there exists a heterosexual and homosexual division of humanity, you pull the rug from underneath them. And then when they say, oh, you're denying they exist, I say, I just don't think it is a basis to divide people up, like blue eyes and red eyes. Blue eyes and brown eyes and what have you. Should we divide human beings into the brown-eyed community, the blue-eyed community? No, people think that would be ridiculous. Well, then likewise, this is also something ridiculous. And again, once we deny that first premise, they don't have an argument, and I could even turn it against them, which I did. I tend to do in that show, but I actually first used this argument on a TV program on the BBC in 2014, where I said that you, the West, you discriminate. You're the discriminators because you said that they are different. They're a separate community from everybody else. So you discriminated, not us. We didn't discriminate at all, right? So that is basically, a way to engage to the topic. But Islamically speaking, as everyone knows, sex outside of marriage is prohibited, and same-sex intercourse is prohibited, and sodomy is prohibited. These are obviously well-known prohibitions in Islam. But we don't talk about communities. We don't talk about identities based on sexuality. This is a Western thing. And as Muslims, we're best advised to avoid that, because if you accept the Western premise, then you'll eventually be pushed to accept the Western conclusion. If you deny the premise, you don't have to follow its conclusion.
So Jake, there's one issue which is saying that, okay, Islam prohibits LGBTQI issues, but what Qatar is doing is that they're instituting it in law. That's the issue. That's what people would say is the problem. You can have your personal beliefs if you want to say it's morally a sin, but don't institute it in law.
Yeah, but I don't see the problem with that, because it's their country, right? It's their choice to make the laws for their country as they please. And I just want to point out some hypocrisy with that. For example, we have certain laws in the U.S. in which a man cannot marry more than one woman, right? So I can point out the fact that, well, if I wanted to have more than one wife, or a Muslim man wanted to have more than one wife in the U.S., legally, he cannot do that, right? And it's actually considered illegal. So, I mean, if you take the Western premise, or this sort of secular understanding that love is love, and as long as they're consenting adults, well, then they should be able to get married. Why couldn't a man and a woman in a consenting adult relationship, right? Why couldn't a man get married to more than one woman? And most, well, I shouldn't say most, but many people who are secular liberals will attack Islam for this position. Oh, it degrades women. It allows men to have more than one wife. Well, if the man is agreeing to it and the woman is consenting to it, right, and there's no pressure or anything like that going on, well, if love is love, why can't a man have more than one wife? So it's complete hypocrisy, because in I don't know if it's the same thing in England, although I hear similar things, but I know for sure in the U.S. it's actually illegal to get married to more than one woman.
Yeah, in the UK, same.
Yeah, so if you have this law, right, and yet if it's with consenting adults, how does that go against your own principles, right? Because given their own principles of, well, if it's just two consenting adults and there's no harm to be done, well, there's no harm, there's consent, right? So what's the problem? Why can't they get married? Well, they don't allow that, but yet they want to attack Muslim countries, or countries that are instituting certain laws against homosexual marriage, right? But then when it comes to on the opposite side of the spectrum, they're not actually allowing Muslims to have their rights to have more than one wife in their countries. It just seems like complete hypocrisy. The reality is they want everything to be open and to people to have as much freedom as they see fit, right? So they want people to have as many options as they think are appropriate. But when it conflicts with their ideology, then they want to say, no, well, we're going to institute laws against this. So, I mean, it just seems like ridiculous. If you think it's okay for you to have your laws with respect to marriage that don't allow certain liberties for Muslim men to have more than one wife, then why are you going around now complaining about how other countries make their laws and not allowing for homosexual marriage, right? So it just seems like, again, hypocrisy and inconsistency from my side, what I can see.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think it's a good point that you raised in terms of the hypocrisy, that there's no single standard that they seem to be consistent upon with regards to this issue of LGBT. And there are going to be laws that are restrict. And I think the point here is that the laws that are going to restrict from Western liberal secular standard, they are going to reflect the values of Western liberal secular standard. Yeah. And similarly, the laws that
They're
are coming
supposed to. Yeah.
Yeah. And the laws that are going to come from the Muslim world are going to reflect the laws and the values of Islam. But I think where you see the problems with the West is that on the one hand they say two consenting adults can do whatever they want, including polygamous marriages, and then they don't accept that. But then when it comes to the Muslim world, they're saying, you must accept that everybody has free choices, and they don't do that in their own countries.
Yeah. I mean, if love is love, and all they care about is consent, right? So you have two consenting adults. There's no pressure or anything like that. I don't see what the problem is. There's no harm. There's consent, which are the principles that they care about. So it's consistent with their own principles to allow a Muslim man and a woman to get married and to be a part of a polygamous relationship, right? But they don't allow it. I mean, they've declared it to be illegal. I mean, and that's how it is in the US and same thing in England. So it's just complete hypocrisy. They don't have any consistent standard, because if it were really just merely about the consent and the no harm principles, then they should be allowing it, but they don't. So they're clearly biased, in my opinion, against Islamic narratives. And that's why they want to attack Qatar for having laws against homosexuality, right? But where's the outrage from these secular liberals, parading around in places like the UK and the US saying, no, we want to fight for the Muslim man's right here to get married to more than one wife? They don't do that. And in fact, when you bring it up to some of them, they'll start attacking it and saying, no, that's belittling women. You guys are against women, blah, blah, blah. Well, hold on. If the woman is consenting to it, right, and there's no harm involved, and she's an adult, what's the problem? It's perfectly consistent with their own principles. So they really have no argument against it. And it just shows that it's based on their own values, and it's just emotional at that point. So, yeah. I mean, I just see it as complete hypocrisy.
Abdullah, I want to check something with you. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to add to that. So, I mean, on the program, I raised that issue that said, well, polygamy law is not allowed in the UK, and they didn't. I said, if a spouse wants to have more than one of them, they're okay with more than one of themselves being in the marriage to their husband, or vice versa. Where's the problem with then? Well, how come that's illegal? And they didn't answer that. But there's another.
Yeah, they didn't even bite on that, right? They didn't.
Yeah, they didn't want to bite on that. But there's another argument. There's a further one you can add to that to the list, which is why not allow siblings to engage in consensual, non-reproductive incest? Yeah, so two brothers, if they want to be gay, why is that illegal in the West? If a boy and a girl take contraception, why is that illegal in the West? And of course, you could even press that a little bit further. In a debate with an atheist in Canada, actually, I knew they would say that that incest is wrong because it could cause problems with the children, might end up with some kind of congenital diseases. I say, okay, if that's the basis by then prohibiting it, then you're justifying eugenics. Then we should euthanize or prevent anyone who has deficient genetics from marrying each other because if they're two carriers of a certain disease or something like this, like cystic fibrosis, if there's two carriers, then they should be prevented from marrying as well. So you want to go down that pathway, it's even worse, because then you're going to have eugenics programs are justified. And if you say, okay, then we won't allow eugenics programs, then you must allow incest fully.
Yeah, or forced sterilization programs as well, to sterilize people who have got potentially passing on bad genes, and cause deformities in babies, like for Down syndrome. There's a 60% chance.
Do you know what? There was a moment in the debate. Now, before we're doing any debate, many debaters, as I'm sure Jake will tell you, we don't just carry all the knowledge in our head at all times. We prepare for particular debates because you need to update yourself on the particulars of a particular case, just to check if things are the way they are. When it comes to political debates, more so because you need to check the status of laws, what's the most current laws in effect, past precedents and things like this. And so I actually thought that the debate wasn't going to be on what it was going to be on, or thought it was going to be mostly on LGBTQ and Qatar. And I came to that discussion, but then when they started to bring up these other points, and I said, and I was having that back and forth, and the host said that is it not true that in Qatar a person who is engaged in sodomy can be sent to jail for 7 years, a maximum of 7 years. Now I said, well, the law actually doesn't say that. It says 3 years, but that's the same punishment for fornication as well between opposite sex couple as well in Qatar. And then, oh well, 3 years, that's still going to jail. And I didn't check the latest. I didn't revise the latest laws in the UK. In the UK, if you engage in a consensual polygamous marriage, you could be sentenced to jail for 7 years. Right, in the UK. So I wish I wish I knew a bit more about what the event was. They told me that it was going to be.
Abdullah, you're frozen, I think, from our end. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think he cut out there. Yeah.
Hopefully, inshallah, we'll come back in.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I think it's coming back.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah, you're back.
Okay, sorry.
You were saying that you wish they would have told you a little bit more about the discussion, and then you stopped.
Well, yes, because this is a program I've never been on before. This channel, I've never been on this channel before, so this was brand new to me.
I've never heard of the channel.
Yeah, it's a brand new left-wing initiative kind of a channel. So they were initially just saying we're just going to have a discussion to basically clear up misconceptions about the Islamic stance on LGBTQ, and I was going to make those points I've already made, in essence, that we ban sodomy, we ban fornication, but we don't discriminate humans into these categories that were invented in the 19th century to discuss sexual kind of sexual mental psychopathies or things like this. So obviously this bit wasn't, I didn't come with this the exact number of 7 years was actual, and it was the exact number that she used to say that Qatar will send you to 7 years in jail for engaging in homosexual activity or what have you. And the irony is you get sent to jail for consensual polygamy up to 7 years in the UK. Just a small little nugget, and so on and so forth. But also, I mean, that show, they didn't even tell me that Mariam Namazi, who's a member of the Council of Ex-Muslims, they didn't even tell me that she was going to be on. They just said I was going to debate Peter Tatchell and some right-wing guy, and then I turn up on the day, and she's basically just there on the. Literally, I come into the studio, being mic'd up, and she's just basically there to discuss. Of course, I suspect that if I had walked off, they would have said, look at this Muslim guy scared of debating Mariam Namazi, and they would have. So it was like, what do? You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Well, I mean, it was easy to engage her, but I actually invited to a one-on-one debate. It was actually being arranged by another university, the London School of Economics and Political Science, to do a one-on-one debate. I mentioned this on the show that she wouldn't debate me one-on-one, but she wanted to have her friends with her to hold her hand and basically all join a chorus of shouting out, trying to shout out the Muslims. So anyway, just a little bit of a fun fact about what happened on the day with this new channel, this new left-wing channel and the program that no one's heard before.
Just to remind the audience, you have the opportunity to join the discussion today and ask your questions, make your comments. Prefer people who are liberal, non-Muslim, atheists, who think, Qatar shouldn't host the World Cup because of their human rights abuses, etc. Or even if you are non-Muslim and you think actually no, Qatar should have the right and that the West is hypocritical as well. And also, we don't restrict Muslims as well joining the stream as well. So if you want to join, that'd be great. This one's for you, Jake. What's the point? Do you want them to legalize polygamy?
Well, no, that's actually not the main point. The main point is just calling out the West for their hypocrisy, is that they want to criticize other countries for their laws and how they're governing their countries, especially when it comes to marriage. But then, based on their own principles, they're inconsistent with their own principles, because if it is merely about two consenting adults, right, and there not being any harm or potential for harm, well, then there's no reason, there's no argument, given their own principles and what they're supposed to be consistent with, that they should have polygamy as illegal. That's the point. And yet they do. And then, even when you bring this up to many liberals, they'll start attacking it and say, well, you just want to put women down and, subjugate them and all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, hold on a second. If the women are consenting to it and they're adults and there's no harm, then what's your problem? Oh, it's because you have certain values that apparently, for whatever reason, I don't know why, because it doesn't even seem like they really have an argument, given their own first principles of why they would be against things like polygamy. But I think they just see it as something foreign to them, that they don't like, they don't want to accept, and they're going to attack it. And so the point is, no, it's not about like I'm going on this campaign to get polygamy instated and for it not be illegal in the West and things like England and the US. No, I'm not going around doing that, but I'm just calling out the West for their hypocrisy, that given their own position, it shouldn't be illegal. That's the point. And yet, if they are allowed to have their positions and what laws they institute when it comes to their society, then why are they whining about Qatar for doing the same thing when it comes to how they see marriage and the laws that they want to put forward, right? So I'm just saying that the West is not consistent. Now, secondarily, if they were to make polygamy, if they were to make it legal and to remove any sort of punishments against it, then yeah, I mean, I think that that's a good thing, secondarily, because that is in line with Islam. But that's not the main point of what I'm saying.
Yeah, no problem. Jazakallah khair. I think that's pretty clear in terms of that point. I was just going to also say Jazakallah khair to Abdulrahman, who became a YouTube member for us. So appreciate that. Yeah, I think Jake's made the point, which is that it's just pointing out the hypocrisy. I was going to ask, I want to go on to this question, but I was going to ask this question because I remember a few years ago, I heard about Denmark having animal brothels. Do you remember that, Abdullah? Oh, Jake, have you heard about that?
I'm trying to forget.
It's true, isn't it? That they
I
have.
I heard about it, but I didn't read much into it. But yeah,
I'm just thinking, the way sometimes the way the liberals in the West view Qatar and LGBTQI issue is the way Muslims in the Muslim world, they view things like bestiality, or the West, how they would view bestiality generally. And can you imagine in a country which permits bestiality, like maybe Denmark, from what I've heard, and I did a quick Google search beforehand, and it did come up confirming, yeah. Can you imagine them going to a country like Britain and saying, love is love? Yeah. How dare you restrict the ability for people to express and animals to express their love? Yeah. And this is something that should be condemned. People will be like, what the heck are you talking about? This is crazy talk. Yeah. But there is a professor, he's Professor Peter Singer. I don't know if you heard of him, Jake. He's a moral professor and he's a consequentialist. And he argues this point. He actually argues for that bestiality or zoophilia should be allowed. This is something that should be accepted. So, he's made this point very clear. And this is the point I think Muslims need to also sort of mention, because I think this is something that would it would resonate with people in the West, which is that the LGBTQI issue is not just about homosexuality. It's about the idea that human beings are sovereign. And we're getting to a stage where this idea of human beings are sovereign, that they can choose anything. They can choose to be a boy, a girl, some intermediate state between a boy or girl, non-gender identified, whatever it is, and that they have this right and ability to do so even at the age of 4 or 5, be put on hormonal blockers. How crazy, Yeah, these things seem to us today. Yeah, you go back 10 years ago, not even that long ago, 10, 15 years ago, people would think you are crazy if you were to suggest this, just as the way people think we are crazy now to say that the West might permit bestiality en masse in different countries. They would have thought you're crazy to say 5-year-olds would be transitioning from male to female. Yeah. So, people need to be aware of how this is this type of, antagonism to these types of cultural practices exist within the parts of the world. Just because you're born and brought up in the West and you've been mass exposed to LGBTQI, that you think this is norm and therefore anybody outside of it isn't. Well, actually, just simply a product of your environment. And if you go outside, the way that they perceive what's occurring in the West, they think that's abnormal. Whereas what people in the West perceive what's occurring in the Muslim world, they see that as abnormal as well. We've got brother Muhammad from Dawais. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
We can't hear you. No sound coming through, brother. No sound.
It may, no, it's okay. It may help if I unmute myself.
No, yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Interesting discussion. So I think this last point that you made there, which is the one of the individual is sovereign, it actually goes deeper than that, doesn't it? Because it's actually fundamentally the idea that there is no foundation to any meaning at all. So this idea of nominalism, right? Because this is where the discussion actually starts, right? The left have decided that everything is subjective, and on that foundation, they have no right to go to another nation state and tell them what to do on their principles. So I find the hypocrisy there on several levels to start with, because if this is your foundation, then why would you even attempt to tell another nation state that what they've decided for themselves is somehow not agreeable to you, because you actually don't have that right under the premises that you supposedly hold to. So that's the first point. So Abdullah Andalusi, what do you think about that? I think that's a very basic point to make.
I mean, that was indeed a point I was stressing in the discussion. I said that, look, the Islamic paradigm is that the creator of the universe owns the human body, and therefore I was being shouted at as I was saying this, but I basically said that in essence, why these are sins, why these are kind of evil acts, fornication and the like, is because you don't have the consent of the owner of the body, which is what the West like to say, that you own yourself, and therefore if you don't give consent for people to make sexual advances upon you, this is what is rape, right? Whereas I say, well, actually, from the Islamic perspective, God owns you. You didn't make yourself. You didn't create yourself. In many ancient cultures, they believe that the parents own the children, because the parents made, they thought, superficially speaking, the parents made the child. So if you didn't make yourself and you don't, then what gives you the idea that you own yourself? You could also argue, what does it even mean to own anything in a material universe? There's only matter and forces. There's no such thing as ownership, right? Could you say the sun owns you because we're in its gravity well? Well, no. So what is ownership then? So, you could then basically just show the vacuity in the materialistic viewpoint, which is that they have no basis to justify ownership, nor that the person, whatever that is, defined as, owns themselves in the first place. And from the Islamic perspective, because the creator of the universe owns us, and owns us because literally he controls and is sustaining us. So there's no better definition of ownership you can get than that, and is the sole creator, the sole sustainer of ourselves. Then he can dictate to us what is our good, what is our bad, because we were made for a purpose. And of course, I also argued that good and bad is meaningless if you have no meaning, as in if you have no purpose. So because good and bad is defined by whether you fulfill a purpose. A good car
is a car that gets you from A to B. A bad car is with no engine, no wheels. It doesn't get you from A to B, its purpose. So good and bad only makes sense with regards to purpose. So I was showing that there's an Islamic, the Islamic foundation is solid, whereas the the current liberal foundation in vogue in the West is not solid at all whatsoever. But I wanted to raise very, very quickly just two, you could say, clarifications to Brother Sharif. So in Germany and Denmark, there was animal brothels. It was legal at some point, but they did ban it basically since 2013. And hormone blockers, the claim is that hormone blockers are reversible. So they just put a pause on puberty, as according to one a liberal spokesperson. They just put a pause on it, and you can then recommence it when the child decides what gender it is, as if children can make adult decisions that will affect the rest of their lives. But hey, not when it comes to that 15-year-old sister that went to join ISIS. Oh, she's an adult, right? But when it comes to anybody else, they can't. Then they're not adults. But then when it comes to changing their sex, they are adults. It's so kind of inconsistent. The problem with that is now been discovered that if you put hormone blockers on children, you cause you cause a variety of diseases that occur, developmental diseases, issues with bone formation and density and things like this. To name but a few, I won't go into a very long list of it. So there are issues with that. But when transsexuality came up in the discussion, well, it didn't come up in discussion. I actually tried to bring it up, but they didn't want to hear it. They talked about female genital mutilation. They brought that up. I said this a couple of years ago. I am waiting for them to say male genital mutilation when it comes to Muslim boys getting circumcision. I'm waiting for the liberals to go there. They're going to go there at some point. It's difficult because obviously Jews do that same practice, and they don't want to appear to be intolerant like a certain faction of Europe in 1939. But before 1939. But they're going to go there, right? But currently they'll just say FGM, and I immediately pointed out that I tried to argue that if you're saying that what is heinous about it is the mutilation of the genitals, right? That's what's heinous about it, is mutilation of the genitals. Then why is transsexuality legal? Is there not a greater mutilation of the genitals that occurs on a fully transitioned person, right? So then they might argue, we mean elective genital mutilation is okay, but non-elective one, as in done without consent of the child. So okay, well if Muslim, they're going to argue that Muslim boys don't have consent at some point. They're going to make the argument, and of course, caveat, obviously, we don't condone, and it's actually against Islam, the practices of quote unquote FGM, as it's called in many countries, a practice that predates Islam by thousands of years. By the way, these practices are not dictated or mandated by Islam. But my point being is that they are just very inconsistent. What if then, if the girls from these pre-Islamic, actually even pharaonic practices, decided to engage in female gender, to do the FGM once they became women, would that be okay then? Is that the only issue that liberals have with that, right? So they're very inconsistent with their bases. They're very confused in their bases, and I could make a great argument from a liberal basis. I could say that even if you're an adult, even if you're, let's say, 20 years old, and you decide to fully transition to being to transsexual, quote unquote, i.e., to mutilate your genitals, as to use the nomenclature that the West use against might use against Muslims, circumcision of males, then you are impinging the free choice of your 40-year-old self, who might not want to have lost their part of their body, right? If someone cuts off their arm in the West, you don't have the freedom to do that. They'll assume that you're insane, and they'll take you to a mental asylum and so on and so forth. You don't have the right to kill yourself as well in England and in most Western countries, because again, that's infringing upon your individuality, your individual sovereign right that could change its mind in the future potentially. But you are allowed to do life-changing, irreversible, irreparable mutilations of the body because of a a decision that could be taken on whim potentially, right? So they're very
you can
inconsistent.
you can cut something off, but just not an arm or a leg.
Well, there was an interesting quip, and it's a bit light-hearted, but it was an interesting quip that somebody made on Twitter, I think. They said, my little boy a few weeks ago wanted to be a fire engine. Should I now take him to the doctors and have him put on medication so he can become a fire engine? I mean, kids go through these. I mean, for anybody who's got kids, know they go through these phases. Do you want to be a policeman? Yes, I want to be a policeman. Do you want to be a, chicken? Yes, they'll say I want to be a chicken, because kids do this. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't, and yet they're using that as presumption of consent. Now the question is there a definition of consent anywhere, Abdullah? Is there a definition of what? Because this is presumed content. Consent. You're assuming this child knows understands. They've internalized the meaning of what they're asking for, and they've agreed to it. So, what is the formal definition of consent? Is there such a thing?
Well, I was basically just looking at. I received a message from a colleague of mine who's watching this, and he wanted me to mention that he said that during the 1966 World Cup that was in England, England had banned homosexuality or banned sodomy, what have you, right? So, if we're going to be consistent, must the UK be stripped of its World Cup, the trophy, the 1966 trophy, or the win or whatever, the recognition of it, because at that time it had made homosexuality or same-sex intimacy illegal at the time, right? So anyway, I mean, obviously, then they're going to say, oh well, everyone was at that time, everyone was banning it. It was not an issue. I say, okay, well then it depends on majorities, then, doesn't it? What's right and wrong? Anyway, so you argued, is there a definition of consent? There is. Let's get back to that topic. There is multiple competing schools of thought with the issue of what is consent, because is consent just the person giving formal assent? Right? So okay, I give you permission. But if you put a gun to their head and you say, do I have permission to take your money? And I say, yeah, okay, I'll give it to you. Is that consent? Well, no, because you have basically you have coerced them with a means of motivating them to give you something that they wouldn't otherwise do so. But then what if I'm a salesperson and I tell them that if they don't buy this great car, they came in to buy a more modest car, but they don't buy this great car, then they're not going to get they're not going to, women won't go out with them, and people will think they're a cheapskate or what have you, and there'll be social consequences, negative ones, of buying a cheaper car. So the fear of negative social consequences might motivate that person to buy a better car. And you might say, well, you've given them a motivation by fear of some loss of some kind. Is that also then depriving them of their consent? Because most people make choices based on motivation, right? And so then where is the line of how much motivation is now no longer gives that person consent anymore, and how much motivation is okay within the limit of maintaining their free will consent? Humans are motivated by their desires, and whoever can leverage those desires can control them, much like subhanallah, the verse of the Quran. I was bringing this in because must mention the wisdom of the Quran, subhanallah. The Quran says about those who take their own desires as Rabb, as lords, right? It compares them to being like cattle, and they're worse than cattle because cattle don't have intellect. But why cattle? Because if you make your desires your lord, then you are a slave to anyone who can manipulate your desires. Basically, advertising firms and industry and social peer pressure and a whole number of things. You'll be slaves to things that can control, that can dictate the terms of you achieving your desires. So anyway, I'm not going to go too much into different schools of thought within the West regarding consent. That's a bit more of a philosophical discussion, but
no, that's fine.
Like I say, they don't have a consistent basis.
Right. So, I mean, what this leads on to then, why even have an age of majority then in that case? Because on another part of law, there is this idea of an age of majority, which, you can vote. You can't vote until you're 18, which is decide political whims and desires, and yet you can change your entire life
at some age at 5, 6, or 7. So why the disparity? This is really, for me, part of that hypocrisy.
It's arbitrary.
Exactly, completely arbitrary, and yet when they look at this and you question them, what they will say is typically they'll come back and say this was the precedent or the prevailing law at whatever time, and we follow that. And yet, if you go to different countries, the age of majority is different. So if they're being consistent, they should advocate for a consistent age of majority in countries that don't have the one that they have, or change the one that they have for the one that is most liberal according to them around the world.
Well, I can give an interesting argument, which is that if the age of consent is defined by when a person becomes adult, they can make mature decisions and know the full ramification of things, and then I could argue that if you look at the youth today in many countries, I could say that if anyone has consensual relationship with a person who's even 19 or even 20, it could be quote unquote pedophilia, although that's not the right technical term, because I think that many people are immature up into the age of even 25, mentally speaking, right? But then what is maturity, right? And who judges what is maturity? Many people say they regret the choices they made when they're 20, 21. They think they were stupid, idiotic. And some people made irreparable choices at those ages. And so, certainly our ancestors that were more mature at earlier ages because life forced that. Responsibility actually matures you. The lack of responsibility actually keeps you more childish, for longer. So, where do we set this? Where do we put this limit? So I concur with you, brother, in the point that you're implying, which is in essence, it is arbitrary and it changes, and Western countries are not even consistent amongst themselves as to what constitutes maturity, which is why you see disparity in the age of consent.
Abdullah, I don't know if you're aware, but Peter Tatchell wrote a paper, or he wrote an article where he argued against having an age of consent. So Peter Tatchell was one, for the audience who don't know, Peter Tatchell is a famous gay rights activist. He's also one of the people that was on the panel that was debating against Abdullah on the issue of Qatar. And yet he actually argues against the age of consent. But then he says in his article, he says, well, people won't accept that. So he wanted to lower it to 14, both gay and heterosexual, consent. Yeah. Others have argued against having age of consent, and have argued that pedophilia, as an example, is a sexual orientation. Yeah. And that some even argue that it doesn't even actually cause harm as well. Pedophilia, it's only the trauma of recounting it, being told that you've done something wrong or incorrect. But this is how these these are Western think tanks, various groups or individuals or even activists, like in Peter Tatchell's case. This is what they argue. So it's constantly changing. So, for example, homosexuality used to be, the age of consent used to be 18. And then I think only a few years ago, it got reduced to 16 to be in line with heterosexuality. And even then, if you're 16, 17, or even 18 at college, and you have an affair with your teacher, then that's considered pedophilia, or that's, it's illegal because potential grooming issues regards to that. So even then, it's not very clear in terms of what is the actual age of consent that exists. So I just wanted to read this one, the super chat out, that the MRAs do point out the double standards of the larger liberal ideology feminists in condemning FGM but not MGM, male genital mutilation, is that even some feminists do. Intactivists, I don't know who they are, but you're right. There are people out there.
Intact, yeah, keep it intact.
Oh, intactivists. Okay, I thought it was a typo there. So, but yeah, there are people out there that tries to push this as an argument, as an idea.
So going back to I was going to ask you, going back to the 220 billion, you said they shouldn't have got it. So where should they have spent that money? How should they have spent it?
So yeah, so I think somebody made that point earlier, saying, "Well, how come we've not raised the issue of 220 billion?" Which we did actually in the beginning of the stream.
Yeah, we did.
Just so people are unaware, we had problems with the stream. I think there was the Matrix got us. Yeah, as Andrew Tate would say, the Matrix tried to shut down the stream, so we had to restart the stream again. So we did discuss this topic about Qatar and the fact that it was wasteful. In terms of the amount of money that they spent. Mohammed, you asked the question, where should they have spent it? I think there's lots of things that they could spend it upon. 220 billion, it's not like, it's not an insignificant number. This can change the whole nations. And we're not talking about Qatar itself. We're talking about Egypt, we're talking about Syria, we're talking about Pakistan, we're talking about Bangladesh, we're talking about major infrastructural changes and creating nations become first world countries, in developed countries, alleviating poverty, removing, the problems of occupation, potential problems that face the Muslims of Rohingya. This amount of wealth can solve a lot of problems. And rather than building football stadiums and infrastructure for the tourists that afterwards will just go to waste, as we've seen with Olympics and World Cups in the past, where football stadiums are built primarily for one event, and then afterwards nobody uses them after that. So yeah, there's lots of things that they could have utilized it for. But I think maybe one thing that people maybe don't appreciate is that Qatar was a colony of the British for a very long time. I think it was in the 1960s or even later than that. That's when it got its independence. We can maybe check that. But it was relatively soon. And Britain, what they did with regards to these Gulf countries, whether that's UAE, Qatar, Bahrain as well, they created very small states with populations in the hundreds of thousands, which sat on massive amounts of wealth.
Looks like 1971 is when they got it. 71.
So it's not long. It's not we're not talking about hundreds of years ago.
Around the same time as Bretton Woods.
Yeah, that's right. So, but what I was explaining is that you've got small states created by the British because they were well aware that if you had that amount of wealth for a population of 130 million people or 200 million people, then that becomes a sizable power. But a population that doesn't have the capacity to have its own army to defend its own borders, it's they're having to rely upon the West to defend themselves, like Kuwait had to do with regards to Iraq, like Qatar does with Al Udeid air base, which is filled with Western military personnel from the West. So this is why they created this. We brought brother Islamic man that have come on, so I wanted to bring him on. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. First of all, thanks, brothers, for those very interesting discussions. So I had a question for Brother Abdullah, because I watched the debate, and I guess this is kind of a broad question around debating morality, because, if we assume that those people we had, there may be feminists or liberals or whatever, but in general, let's say to generalize that they're utilitarians, right? They just want to do what maximizes pleasure and diminishes pain. If you come with your best arguments, consistence, that actually you could do much better, that their policies are failing, everything, I don't think it will ever even. There are moral assumptions, that at best they can say, well, you're right, we're just going to adopt the Islamic ways, maybe. For example, in Europe or the USA, at some point, was regular. They did refer to Islam, even though they could admit, okay, it's a better way of doing things. So I'm trying to say that in the end, it all comes down to trying to challenge their moral assumptions, because you could also always be a utilitarian, accept any kind of argument. It's like a scientist that has a theory that at some point is failing. They're not going to throw out the scientific method, right? They're just going to say, well, I'm just going to make sure that my new theory will adapt to this anomaly. I hope you get my point.
That's a very interesting question. I think that it's more of a broader question of insincerity. The human mind is a very creative tool, and the sincere person will try to see show where the evidence leads them, what is most likely the case or what is definitely the case. Whereas a person who's insincere will use their mind to produce the most fantastical arguments or mental gymnastics required to give a veneer of justification to their desires. This is the kind of human problem of the insincere, of the munafiqeen, of the kuffar, and so on, so of those who reject truth. If you were to refute them, they'll bring as many arguments as they need to at least give some veneer of acceptability. Because no one who's insincere will say, "Oh, you got me. Okay, yeah, that's well, I guess I'll just have to accept the truth." Well, then they're not going to do that, right? If they're insincere, they're going to try and find anything, no matter how fantastical or how much mental gymnastics they need to do. So, when you engage Western philosophy or Western political theory and moral philosophy, in essence, you do it on the basis of, in a way, you can use Plato's approach in Athens. He didn't really advance any particular philosophy. He just showed how everyone's arguments or claims or definitions of terms even were just arbitrary, and he did so by pointing out the internal contradictions within them. He'd produce some scenario where it wouldn't make sense what they're claiming, and so he was famous for this. And he got so popular that they killed him, right? Because the democracy of Athens killed him. The majority killed him. They said they were corrupting the youth. So that's what we can do, is to basically show how Western arguments from any school of thought that they advance it from has inevitable contradictions that they just can't reconcile. It's like there's a hole in the ship, and as soon as they plug that one hole, two more holes come out, and as soon as they plug those two holes, four more holes come out. So the more they try to plug the holes, the worse it gets, the more fantastical and nonsensical the solution they need to bring. And so that's all we need to do, basically.
Yeah. So, but would you say that somebody who is saying, look, I'm just trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, but I'm willing to accept, different policies, is being insincere and not consistent? You could, for example, say that, in the end, what is good is what maximizes pleasure, and I'm just open to any kind of suggestion from Muslims, from anyone. So I don't see how you showing them that they have a bad policy, that, I don't know, alcohol should be prohibited, will make them reconsider their moral assumption, their moral basis for what is good or evil, if you understand what.
Well, I think the best refutation against utilitarianism is al-Khidr, right? From it was mentioned in the Quran. He was given foreknowledge, knowledge of the future, which was even kind of not given to a prophet that was with him. And so the things he did seemed to be almost bad and evil, almost. Like, what are you doing? What's going on? But he knew exactly what would happen because he was given foreknowledge. The problem with utilitarianism is it requires omniscience. You need to know what actually will make someone not just happy, or not happy, but have maximum pleasure in quantities. No. Contented in the long run, fulfilled in the long run. And humans don't know humans. We're a mystery. The brain is still a mystery to the best neuroscientists in many areas. We don't know what works, right? So then how are we now going to be bumbling about making assumptions as to what is going to maximize pleasure or happiness or contentment, what doesn't? We might do something thinking like, okay, people want to drink alcohol, gives them pleasure, let them drink alcohol. Oh, wait a second, then there's domestic violence, there's accidents on the street, there's violence on the streets, There's infidelity on the rise, a whole number of things. There's kidney disease, a whole number of things rise up from that because the liberalism is short-sighted. It just thinks, well, on ostensibly, just on the it doesn't seem bad, so let's do it. And until the consequences happen, later, much like climate change, full-on capitalism, pollute the earth as much as you want, maximize production. Oops. We didn't see this coming, even though anyone could tell you that pollution was, even 100 years ago, they'll tell you that pollution's a problem and could be problematic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the issue. Utilitarianism requires omniscience, right? You need to know everything about humans, everything about the consequences of actions, everything about societies, every factor you need to know. Then you can make your calculations. Great. But we don't, and we can't process that. And that's that's the ultimate problem with utilitarianism.
The usual pushback I hear from this argument that is kind of based on practicality, like, okay, you cannot really do this kind of utilitarian computation, therefore it's kind of difficult. What I hear usually is that, well, we don't try to say that we will make the best calculation. We just try to get closer. So it's, for example, imagine you have a scientist, they might find a theory. They're not going to tell you, hey, my model perfectly represents the theory. They're just going to say, oh, it is useful for me. We can send a rocket to space and we can refine it, but it's not because I'm not able to perfectly model the reality that I'm not going to try and do my best and refine it. So that's kind of this trying to get at what is best given the evidence, and that is still, I think, a goal worth pursuing, wouldn't you say?
Well, no, that's not the right analogy. The right analogy would be someone launching a rocket into space with no calculations as to where it's going. Let's just go up, and then hoping it hits the moon, right? Because I'm not going to quote Donald Rumsfeld. There's no knowns and there's known unknowns, and there's unknown unknown. We know that there's more unknowns than there are knowns, right? The law of unintended effects or unintended consequences. We know that there are tons of unintended consequences and effects that will happen by any law that's given, what have you. Conservatives, they make their very argument for tradition is that they say tradition is tried and tested. It's what works in the past. Therefore, don't get rid of it, because the slightest change you make could cause catastrophic effects in society. Right? And liberals will be like, no, our formulas say we can do this. Let's do this. So that's really the issue, is that we know that we don't know. Right? It's not that we have all the evidence and we don't know what we don't know. Let's see what happens. No. We know that we don't know, and it's going to be a very bad. There's going to be bad consequences. Even though we actually have some idea that there's problems, like, if we were discussing alcohol drinking, let's weigh up the utilitarian effect of the positives of alcohol versus the negatives. Well, even if we can't do that, we know there are negatives, serious negatives with alcohol drinking, right? And removing people's ability to have inhibitions against animalistic tendencies or what have you, we know that's a bad idea. We don't even need to do this weighing up or calculating. But even in the West, utilitarianism is mostly debunked. It's only left for health service and for economics. It still causes problems in those areas, but generally speaking, the health service is more quantifiable. If we invest X amount of resources in this medication, how many people statistically can survive on this medication versus another medication? They can do that, right? It's has some kind of statistical analysis is possible, right? And with economics, kind of, although there's so many there are problems with that too, as we know. We go through recessions and problems, and it can't be predicted, even though we know they're coming because of the practices of economics. But utilitarianism is not used for laws that conserve public morality. No, it's not argued seriously anymore, utilitarianism, because public morality, you can't, how do you measure happiness? It's hard to measure it. So that's why it's not used there anymore. It's used in health service, it's used in economics, but it's not used in those kind of things. So even the West realizes that this doesn't really work. And so they use a different model for looking at laws that concern public morality, and that is they use individualism, or they call it it's a type of social idealism. Basically, it's almost continental, actually, where they say that the individual should actually flourish and should be unimpeded to do what they wish, as long as they don't prevent the flourishing of other individuals, the fulfillment or the self-actualization of other individuals. You might think, well, isn't that similar to utilitarianism? Well, no, because they could argue using that basis that, for example, if you publicly express that same-sex intercourse is a sin, it's wrong, it's bad in public, you could be causing distress to people or preventing them from actualizing themselves, from flourishing, because you created a negative social environment. And that's what made liberalism kind of mutate into its more intolerant form, or its next stage of its devolution or evolution, which is now, it will now prevent the speech, because speech against things that liberalism deems to be halal inhibits people's practices of what liberalism deems to be halal, and therefore they should be stopped from saying those things. So that they start policing speech in Europe. So anyway, that's the point, that no one really uses utilitarianism for these arguments seriously anymore because of these problems. They use social idealism as a basis for, now it's called social liberalism. So yeah, it's not utilitarianism anymore, because you can't make those calculations. It's good for mathematical, anything that can be statistically rendered, but not good for anything else.
Jake, I don't know if you got any thoughts on utilitarianism, moral realism.
No, not really. Other than what's already been said, no.
Alhamdulillah. Islamic man, have you got any other further questions, or other move on to our next guest? Because I think we're going to be closing the show relatively soonish.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for this thorough answer. Maybe one last comment before I go. I think that sure, if we want to make a fair critique of the Western tolerance, we should not kind of caricature it that it's just being tolerant of anything. You know, I think you like that's not really what they claim. They say things such as, we are not tolerant of intolerance, for example, or they say that, you know, we're tolerant of specific things, but within human rights. So, you know, you cannot just say, yeah, well, they're supposed to be tolerant of everything, and, you know, how can they not tolerate other things? No, it's not really how it works, I think. But yeah, that's kind of a final comment.
Yeah, I think Islamic man, I don't think we're mischaracterizing Western liberal standards. I think what we're saying is a couple of things. Firstly, is that they're inconsistent in the application. So on the one hand, they're tolerating two consenting adults, but on the other hand, if it's two consenting adults in an incestuous relationship, they're not necessarily tolerating that. So that's one issue. And the second issue is when we say they're tolerant, they tolerate, everybody tolerates what's within their paradigm. We're Muslims, we tolerate what's within our paradigm. Yeah, we're very tolerant people. But if it goes outside of paradigm, just like if it goes outside of the Western liberal secular paradigm, they're not going to tolerate it. Yeah. So if it's going to be the case that you have countries that want to predicate their governance upon a religious basis, it goes against secularism, they're not going to tolerate that. If they're going to try to establish Sharia law, they're not going to tolerate that. So we have to be very clear. And I don't know where you're from, Islamic man, but in the UK, there are laws that prohibit, certain types of speech which are not considered illegal. Yeah. So, for example, let's say I work as a teacher, and as a teacher, there is a policy, let's say, of prevent. Prevent is basically this idea that you can identify who's a radical in your classroom. Now, if as a teacher I was to criticize this government policy, I could be sacked from my work, because it's not allowed for an employee in the sector to criticize government policy. He can't do that, even if he disagrees with it. If he works part of the public sector, he has to sustain, consistency in terms of what the public policies are within the public sector. So there are many examples where they are intolerant when it comes to certain types of speeches, certain types of actions, because what they see goes against their values, or they're just inconsistent as well. And that's why many Muslims are very fearful about speaking out, in whether it's at work or whether it's school or colleges or universities, they're very fearful of being able to speak out against Israel, Zionism. They're fearful of speaking out against government policies when it comes to how it's affecting the Muslims, or speaking out against foreign policy of Britain when it comes to the Muslim world. And they don't do that. A lot of them don't do that now.
It's true. What you're saying is correct. Everybody's, tolerant within their paradigm. But what they would say to you, Sharif, is that they tolerate much more, and they allow much more lifestyles. That's what they would say. They would say they tolerate.
But I would still question that. Again, it comes down to what do they tolerate? Because look, from a Muslim perspective, we don't care whether a person within Islamic society adheres to Islamic values or not. Well, let me preface this. If you're non-Muslim and you live as a citizen under an Islamic governance, we don't force the Islamic values upon them. If you're British and you live in Britain, you're expected to profess British values. Yeah, you're taught it. You're not taught anything other than the British values within the schooling system. Even if you go to a religious school, like an Islamic school, you still have to have a subject, citizenship studies, where they promote British values. Whereas in an Islamic governance, you would have a situation where you'd have religious minorities having their own schooling, and they didn't have to teach Islamic values. They can teach their own values. Yeah, for that matter. So there are different grades. For example, another example is in Britain, you can't have Sharia courts. It's prohibited. It's demonized. It's criticized. Even when you have Sharia arbitration, they're not even court systems. They're just arbitrations. That's demonized. But yet within an Islamic paradigm, you're allowed to have non-Muslims have their own court systems, and that's recognized by the government. Yeah.
I've heard about this example, and I think it's a good example. But they would ultimately tell you, Sharif, we can potentially have any kind of laws. We can just vote. We can, we have this, they call it flexibility, we can just go anywhere. So I think it's difficult to win
that's
at this tolerance game.
It's not true. No, that's not true.
They don't. Yeah, they don't do that. They don't allow,
because whoever is the majority is going to win anyway. So it doesn't account for the minorities anyway.
Yeah, but potentially you could have any laws that's being voted by the majority.
It's like saying, but potentially you could, but the majority is going to win out anyway. So if the Muslims are the minority, they're not going to get what they want.
Yeah, but what they're trying to say is that any kind of group can become the majority.
You're just saying, well, it's a potential, but it's not a realistic potential. So it's really doesn't amount to anything.
Well, there's actually one of my counter arguments. I actually used it on the program I attended, which is that actually is the scary thing about liberalism is if you get enough people to believe something. I mean, imagine a Nazi speaking to an average liberal German in 1930s, and the German says the German liberal says to Nazis, look, you can't just persecute Jews and kill them, right? And the Nazi says, oh, but you can get any kind of law you want in Germany if you get enough support behind it, right? And that's what happened, right? To extent that the Nazis, they won elections. They didn't take over by coup exactly. Right? They won the elections, and then they managed to negotiate their way into a majority position, let's just say. So that's the issue, right? There's no actual safeguards against whatever the majority wants. So if the majority of French people have no problem with persecuting Muslim women and Muslims, then who's going to protect them? No one's going to protect them. No one else can do anything about it, right? And of course, in India, same thing, right? If the majority of people vote the BJP party, it'll get into power. But there's two, just for the sake of fact checking, and I'm a bit of a stickler for fact checking if anyone sees what I'm like, but just because I know that there's going to be people watching this, and as well for the sake of the truth, which we're bound to. Sharia courts are not prohibited technically in the UK. They just can never ever be recognized legally by the state. They have Sharia tribunals, and while a British court during divorces and things can listen to, if both sides agree to arbitrate by Sharia tribunal or by a Beit Din, the Jewish version, or a Catholic version of it, the judge can overrule the judgment in the tribunal because it doesn't have any legal weighting It depends what the judge wants.
Yeah.
I think in Canada there was an issue, it was a controversy, and they were banned, or at least not recognized. But when it does come to British values in the UK, the England won't imprison you if you don't follow British whatever British values are. They have other ways of dealing with you if you don't espouse British values. Your kids will be flagged up to the prevent agenda, kind of government officials. They'll be interviewed by government officials. The police will come around to interview them. Scares the kids. They might even argue that you're a bad parent and could possibly take your kids away. You can lose your job if you don't espouse British values, whatever that is defined as, and you could be ostracized. So that occurs in UK. You don't technically go to jail, but you can lose your kids, which is worse than jail technically. And I think last point, and just my final point is to the brother Islamic man. If someone says, "Oh, well, sure, we liberals are not tolerant in some things, but we're more tolerant, than Islamic law is in X, Y, and Z." Well, that's not the case, as Brother Sharif said, that we actually tolerate different law systems, non-Muslims to be under their own law system. We don't force them, or we don't even judge them by Islamic law unless they obviously they cross the community boundary, so to speak, and they transgress against a Muslim. Then of course it becomes a matter for Islamic law. But here's the but. A libertarian could come into this conversation to a liberal and say, libertarianism is better than liberalism because we tolerate so much more than liberals. You can say anything you want. You don't even have to be. You only pay minimal taxes. We don't. We don't tolerate. We tolerate you to take crack cocaine if you want. We're more tolerant than liberals. And then an anarchist can come after the libertarian and say, well, we tolerate people to do whatever they want. I know anarchists don't technically say that, but we don't tolerate government. So people can do whatever they want, not even care about police, not even care about paying taxes at all whatsoever. We tolerate people who don't pay their taxes because we don't believe in government. So you could keep playing the who's the more tolerant game, and liberalism would be on a lower rung because there are things which are much more chaotic that can argue they're more tolerant. So just because people claim they're more tolerant, really just means that they are more negligent of the harms that can exist in society, of dealing with those harms. That's not a virtue. That is indeed a vice. And we should put that at the feet of liberalism, say you are negligent on capitalism, you're negligent on the social ills, on gambling, on so on and so forth, on adultery. You are negligent in protecting the people from these rampant social problems and economic problems and every other kind of, and health problems and so on and so forth. So anyway, that would be my my rejoinder to a liberal who would argue that.
Jazakallah khair, Islamic man. We're going to move on to our next guest, but appreciate your questions.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So we're going to go to the next one. Lucky. But just before that, I did distinguish, Abdullah, between Sharia arbitrations and Sharia courts. So they recognize Sharia arbitrations or allow but they don't recognize Sharia courts.
Yeah, but they don't technically ban Sharia courts. They just don't recognize.
No, but from an Islamic basis, we wouldn't call them courts anyway. We would call. I know sometimes they're called courts, but we call, in essence, they're just arbitrations. Yeah, that they try to do within the Sharia paradigm because they can't be enforced. That's the key issue. They can't be enforced by the state, or they won't be automatically recognized to be enforced by the state. So they are the Sharia arbitration. See, this is the problem. Problem is of the West and the media when they look at this issue of Sharia courts that maybe like local mosque might have. Automatically, they're thinking in their mind, this guy's going to go behind the back of the butcher's shop and cut the guy's hand off, or whatever, or stone some kid, some woman, middle of, I don't know, the park or whatever it is to death or something like that. So crazy stuff like that. But anyway, we've got Lucky on. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Have you got a question or comment that you want to raise to the brothers here?
Question first. So my question is basically that how strong or how valid is the argument from psychology? Because I read this book. It was from to gay students from Harvard, and they took the psychological approach to marketing LGBTQ plus TV shows and movies and basically forms of media. So what they said was in the lines of that you have to make such content so normal that people will come to accept it even if they may not like it. And if you see from the past 20 years, you've seen this trend of more positive um, content towards the LGBTQ plus community, where they're always the ostracized ones, they're always the vulnerable ones, they're always the persecuted ones. So you see this trend, and you have to, like, for me personally, I question how much of the influence is being taken by children from these sorts of media and entertainment. Because from my perspective, children are learning everything from their society, from whatever they're seeing, from whatever they're experiencing. So my question is more like, how valid is the argument from that perspective, that when you're allowing such things to be become normal in your society, children will obviously grow up in confusion. They will have a lot of confusion about who they are, what they feel like. Even if you see in Western countries nowadays, so many children have no idea what gender they are, what sexual identity they have. And I feel like this confusing state is much worse than being restricted in so many aspects, because at least in restriction you know who you are. You don't have to question yourself, and don't have to question the essence of you. But in the Western paradigm, you have to question everything about yourself, and whether or not you even feel this way or that way in this moment or the next moment. So I was wondering how valid is that from as the argument from psychology rather than the moral argument, because moral arguments for me end when um, most of the sovereign wealth fund of Qatar is invested in Western nations and they don't have any problems with that, but they suddenly have a problem with FIFA being held there. So for me, moral arguments end there. But I was wondering how valid is the argument from psychology?
Okay, I'll go to. I was going to go to Jake actually, but he's gone off. So Mohammed, if I can understand the question specifically, you're basically saying, because there's a few points that you were saying. Firstly, is you were talking about how they are pushing the normalization of LGBTQA plus plus. Yeah. On the other hand, you're also saying there's an argument from psychology. Are you saying that people are born that way? Is that the question?
No, no, I'm saying that children are not born in any way. They're born the way they are, what their biology is, what their sex is.
Yeah.
But when they grow up, they learn these things. They learn about you
Okay.
can be something else, you can be
Yeah.
this, you can be that. And this is being made normal through whatever children are consuming. In every aspect of our media, there is some form of LGBTQ plus narrative involved, and children are consuming that on a daily basis. And then they have to, like, they start questioning themselves, if we are feeling this way, if we feel attracted to this person or that person, that gender. And I'm wondering, why don't we make the argument from psychology more that children are learning these things rather than being born this way, because there's no genetic markers, or it's not encoded in their DNA to be different.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I got it.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine. Mohammed, you want to?
Yeah, so first of all, this is actually quite a wide-ranging question, and I appreciate the question. Actually, we need to first. So, if we look way back in certainly in British history and UK history, there was a lady by the name of Mary Whitehouse who campaigned for many, 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 many years against exactly this kind of indoctrination. And what she came up against was the entire institutional establishment of public broadcasting essentially said there is no psychological evidence that what we do influences children. I mean, this was the counter to her position. The reality, of course, is for anybody who's worked in marketing or anybody who's worked in media, is why do they have children's hour at breakfast time? Why do they have toys being advertised on TV? Why do they have specific items that are targeted at children in specific colors at specific times, scheduled in the old public broadcasting era at particular times when they knew children would be watching, when they knew children would be imbibing this information? Because deep down they know that media directly impacts psychology, and psychology then has outward impact on behavior, and then that ultimately results in the consumerization of the child. Essentially, that's what it really boils down to at the end of the day. Now, more recently, there's actually been a very interesting case where Zuckerberg and his team have now admitted that Meta is actually having deep-seated impact on the psychology of children. And for the longest time, they I mean, not just the entire social media sort of establishment essentially said, no, it wasn't. So I think we're running sort of almost two parallel realities here, which is there is the reality of the medical research and the psychological research that is demonstrating real causation and real correlation with some of these activities, and some of this is undeniable. And then we have a media-led, profit-led, productivity-focused corporate establishment that wants to deny this reality. And I would just draw the parallels that this is no different to what happened with the tobacco industry, to what is currently happening with other media industries. Let's just put it there. I don't want to go any further. And it's now happening with the social media industry. So we've got repeat evidence of this happening historically. So it's not a question of it's not being addressed. It's the question of the forces that be are actually aligned with this sort of secular, liberal, social liberal order, and they want a particular narrative to be the narrative of reality.
Yes, because
Okay, I'm gonna have to ask you just for your final point, because we're gonna end the stream soon. We got one more guest, so apologies that just to speed you along, really.
No problem. I agree with you, because if you read, I forgot the name of that book, but if you read that book, you can see that the exact steps of marketing that they told,
Yes.
that they highlighted for how to promote such content. You can see that happening exactly the way they said in the past 20 years, that they should be shown as being persecuted, and that they just want to feel normal, and just like feelings. It's a bit annoying at some point, because feelings are not everything.
Yeah.
I agree, sister. I mean, they've even taken this particular ideology and aligned it with the black rights activism. They've aligned it with almost every other sort of minority group they could find, and they've always couched it in terms of, well, we are like that group, we are like this other group. Therefore, they want to almost inherit whatever emotional reaction we had with this other group. They want to inherit that reaction from you as well to them, and they've succeeded. Why? Because this is a tried and tested method of changing people's emotions. I mean, one very quick point I'll mention: for the longest time, there was no specific fashion or makeup marketing to teenagers. And what you got was in I think around the 1970s and 80s, they did some research and they realized that the market needed to be striated a little bit more. So they created the concept of the tweener. And they realized that there's this age for girls where between 9, 10 and then 11, 12, where they're mature, but they're not quite teenagers. And they sliced out an entire market through exactly this methodology. So this mechanism is, if you want to do X, then go do this process. And you can replace X with any particular viewpoint that you want to position, and it will work. And they've done it repeatedly. So I think, number one, it's recognized, it's understood. But the challenge is, as I said, the narrative that is being driven by those that are in power is the narrative that actually wins at the end of the day. And so the only recourse we have, which is what Abdullah was saying earlier, is we need to stay steadfast on the religion, because at the end of the day, that's the only foundation that we can rely on. And then, because this narrative will change every generation pretty much, or within every generation several times even.
Yes. Fine. Sorry.
Look, yeah, we're going to have to move on, so
Okay. Sorry.
apologies.
Thank you. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah
Yeah.
khairan for your question.
Right.
By the way, brother Abdullah has to go, but he wanted to mention I think it's a course that he has going on, so we should let him do that before we start talking to Muhammad.
We've got one
inshallah.
last guest. I don't know if you want to. You can mention your call, but I don't know if you want to wait for this one last guest.
I have to go pretty quickly.
Oh, right, okay. You mentioned your course then, inshallah.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So yeah, jazakallah for obviously inviting me, brothers, and obviously for your discussion, your points, and obviously raising this topic is very important. So basically, I think many Muslims are struggling to try to understand, obviously, the West, its ideological underpinnings, its foundations, the Western mindset. Even though we live in amongst it, I even argue many Westerners don't fully understand it either, actually. And so one of the courses, there was I was approached by Al-Bala Academy to do a course on the history and intellectual foundations of Western civilization. You can find it on albalagacademy.org, or you can find the link on my Twitter or on my Instagram or YouTube. And basically, it's a 12 session course or 12-week course that starts out from the ancient Greeks all the way to medieval philosophy, and then to in Western Enlightenment philosophy, Anglo-Saxon and continental philosophy, and discussing utilitarianism, discussing the Marxism, socialism, liberalism, and the basis for all these ideas that you're seeing today, where it's coming from, how we got here, basically, and the different schools of thought that there are in the West, and how they all argue their different moral and political points. So if anyone is interested to attend that, it will be an A to Z course on Western philosophy, history, and kind of political moral philosophy. So do please kind of check that out and attend it if you like to. Inshallah, hopefully it would make some sense of a lot of these things that we see going on in the West, and will be useful for any Muslim that wants to engage Western civilization and philosophy, and of course defend the Islamic paradigm, the Islamic worldview against these inconsonant kind of philosophies which the West bring up to try to criticize Islam with. So anyway, if you're interested in that, please go to check out the link, and please avail yourself of this course, inshallah. And barakallahu feekum to the brothers for entertaining me here today, and my babbling of the various different Western philosophies and ideas and things that are involved in this. And inshallah, hope to see you guys all again soon on a future podcast. So till then, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam. Jazakallah khair to brother Abdullah for coming. So we got brother Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
How are you, brothers? I'm doing good. Alhamdulillah. Brothers, I just wanted to raise something and just wanted to see what you guys think about it. And it's to answer more so of the question, why should Qatar shouldn't host the World Cup? And it's not got to do with the political reasons that people are bringing forth, but more so on something that I believe is being taught in the Quran that people overlook. God said so we have to be loyal to God, right? So there's things that you do that shows loyalty to God. And then the other thing is God is saying that you get to pick. Some people want the worldly life, and some people want the hereafter, Jannah, inshallah. So and God said that إنما الحياة الدنيا له ولعب. So it's the worldly life is literally having fun and entertainment and getting things, and the more you're spending more time on that, and the more you're giving more time towards that, you're showing God, you're telling God, God, I rather I'm buying into the world more than the hereafter. So I mean, from a personal level, I find a lot of Muslims are wasting their time on things that don't bring their benefit to them. And yes, it is entertainment. Yes, there is some sports to it, but I guess it's causing more delusions and more people falling into these arguments that don't bring any benefits. Who cares about the LGTV? They've been around forever trying to say their stupid ideologies, right? But we're giving them a way to like attack us because we want to copy them and things they're doing, which is like going to world events of soccer and playing teams that, again, it doesn't bring any benefits. Like I believe the Quran and God is teaching us is like what you're giving, like you're a recipe, and whatever you're putting in yourself is the end result, right? And if God gave you the destiny to walk to Mecca, he gave you enough time to reach Mecca. And the more time you waste, the further you're away you're going to be from your destiny. So I believe, like us as a community, we shouldn't be focusing on things like the World Cup and things like and things to of that nature. It's because we should be focusing on how we can make the world a better place. Like our ibadah is serving God, so we should be serving God and playing soccer and cheering for a nation that isn't our nation, or talking smack about another team. It's not going to change anything, and I feel like it causes more division than it does unity, and we can see that from year to year.
No, it's a really good point, Mohammed. I think what we have to appreciate as well, I think because secularism and capitalism is so dominant within the world, sometimes we don't realize that what they do is they promote entertainment, they promote distractions. That's part of the ideology that exists. It's to try to maximize benefit by creating distractions, creating entertainment. And because of that, it does literally distract us away from understanding our purpose of life and reflecting. And that's why you find within the Western societies and Western nations, people don't want to read, deep books. They don't want to contemplate about their life. They don't want to contemplate about big questions. Yes, you'll find some people who will do that, but the vast majority of people are consumed by entertainment, whether that's sports, or whether that is Netflix, films, movies, cinemas. And so with that point that you mentioned, Mohammed, which is a really good point, what we have to look at in what's occurring in the trend in the Muslim world is that this idea that we need to sort of create our own sort of, what's the word, forms of entertainments and distractions. But by doing so, in essence, we're sort of following the path of what we're seeing within Western nations, and we see this within Saudi Arabia, the number of boxing matches now that they're putting up there, or the concerts that they've had there. And
Or
I think
Halloween.
Halloween, yeah. These are all entertainments. These are all aspects to distract us, away from. And I think these are all of the sort of the the entertainment industry that exists within the West, which is now sort of being brought to the Muslim world. So, although I'll be honest with you, I do like football. You know what I mean? So I like the drama of it. I don't support any particular team, but the drama of the football match, especially when you have a rubbish team like one of the lesser teams trying to play against the stronger teams, and the fact that Germany got knocked out of the World Cup at the group stages, that was just great. But it is a good point that you mentioned, and I think it's a point that we have to be very careful upon, because things like football or things like entertainment generally are consuming, and they are designed to be consuming. They are designed to be addictive, and they are part of an economic industry, the entertainment industry, which is there to try to maximize its wealth, even if it means that you become less productive. I don't know if you have any further points, Mohammed, or
no, that's it. No, thank you very much. And yeah, so I just wanted to kind of raise the issue and see, for people to talk about it. It's just to remind people, like, we're here to serve God, and playing soccer is not serving God. so alhamdulillah. Okay, assalamu alaikum, brother. Thank you very much for the time, and it was an amazing stream. Thank you very much, and inshallah we meet in Jannah.
Inshallah. I mean, we've got one final person, Omnom.
Oh yeah, hey guys, how are you? I didn't really want to say. I didn't really want to say anything. I just logged in to write the comment because I think perhaps the person I like before this guy, she talked about some study, some paper or some book she read about the psychology or something. I think she was referencing probably a work done by Dr. Sharif. He's a guy that lives in Boston in the U.S. So I just wanted to type the comment that there's a very good lecture that Dr. Sharif did on Blogging Theology's channel about Islam and LGBT. It's like a very, very nice, long lecture. And, you know, something very important that he pointed out is the fact that we have to try and understand the categorization that the world has created, where you are either homo or heterosexual, for example. This is a categorization that did not exist, generally speaking, in the Muslim world. It's not something that is something that we have to try and take ourselves out of that paradigm and understand that this is something that isn't a given, let's say. I just wanted to type in the comment. I didn't want to come on or say anything.
All right,
But since I'm here, I'll just say one thing to Jake. I just wanted to say that you have some amazing performances. You know, like you post amazing videos on the ones that you did in Speaker's Corner. You had a very, very funny comeback to one of the guys you talked to when he was saying that he believes in contradictions, and then you told him yes, no, yes, no. I just want to say that was one of your greatest performances, in my opinion. It made me laugh out loud.
Okay, alhamdulillah, I appreciate that.
Thank you, guys. Just the lecture, just people to watch the video. I think it's an amazing lecture to watch.
Yes, I think that's on Blogging Theology. Yeah. Sorry, Jake.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, no, I saw it. It's a good video.
Yeah. No, alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair for that. So if that's pretty much, I think that's everybody in the live chat. Who came on the guests. We don't have any more. So I don't know if you got any final words that you want to say, Jake and Muhammad, before we go. Jake, about Qatar, about the World Cup. Who are you supporting, Jake?
Oh, I was supporting Senegal today, but unfortunately they lost. And I'm supporting Morocco. So they're the last Muslim majority country left. So inshallah they can beat Spain, but we'll see. But yeah, no, I wanted to comment on the polygamy issue that I was raising earlier. So there was a study and a poll done by Gallup, and I can actually copy the link here, so if people want to check it out. 1 second here, just post it in the chat. So they did a poll on the moral acceptability of different, like, sort of what would seem controversial categories. So they went through birth control, drinking alcohol, gambling, homosexual relations, all these different kind of things. One of them was polygamy, and only 20% of the people who were polled, which were Americans in this case, said that polygamy was morally acceptable. So 80%, almost 80%, 78%, there were 2% who said, I don't know, they just didn't care, said that it was morally unacceptable. And I would just like to know from a liberal secular perspective, on what basis are they considering it to be morally unacceptable? And here's something interesting. If people go to it, right underneath polygamy, you'll see suicide. Well, guess what they said for suicide? 18% said that it was morally acceptable. So the difference between polygamy and suicide was only a 2% difference, right? So almost as many people who think that suicide is morally acceptable accept polygamy. So they almost see polygamy and suicide on the same wavelength, which is just, I mean, when I saw it, because I was just, doing some Googling while we were waiting, I was quite shocked. And this isn't like some random poll. This is seen pretty much as a reputable resource for doing these kind of polls and stuff. So I just wanted to share that, because you're talking about these issues like polygamy and homosexual marriage and these things. And it's just quite shocking to me that Americans view polygamy in terms of moral acceptability on par with suicide, which is just quite shocking.
Jazakallah khair. So people can have a look at that particular Gallup poll. Muhammad, Jazakallah khair for coming on.
Thank you for thank you.
We always love having you coming on to our streams. Appreciate that. Have you got any thoughts about the Qatar World Cup? Final
well, I was sort of secretly supporting Senegal today, but my rest of my family.
You don't support England?
I have to now. I have no option.
You have to.
I have to because they went through, right? So yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm being forced to now. Yeah, okay. There's family pressure on that. No, the one thing I would add is I think the brother that came on earlier, I think, who was talking about liberalism in all of its guises. I would say, look, when we get into discussions with individuals like this, the problem we have is in their mindset, they only have two sets of rules, and the two sets of rules are: number one, does it concern me? I.e., is what's happening going to affect me personally? And secondly, is it illegal? So what's happened is within this sort of secular liberal paradigm, what's happened is the concept of legal injury has taken precedent over morality. And as long as you can demonstrate legal injury or there is no legal injury, it's allowable, which is the slippery slope they've been on for many, 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 many years now. And that's one of the reasons you have is whenever you're talking to individuals like that, you can never lock them down because these two principles they're using are very fluid. And so ultimately, the only way to sort of close out those conversations is to lock them down to the idea of, do they believe in any kind of absolutes at all? Whether it's in terms of good, whether it's in terms of morality, whether it's in terms of their own decisions, is anything absolute? And if they say no, then I think there's no way they will agree to anything otherwise. And then you really need to, as we say, you need to take them on a journey of changing paradigms, which is a whole different discussion that we need to go on. And that's really what I would say is you need to lock down what's really underpinning their thoughts. And if they're not deep thinkers, I think you've already got a difficult challenge there already anyway.
Yeah, no,
and that's it. But Jazakallah, thank you very much. And great program, by the way. And I love always listening to Brother Abdullah Andalusi. He's been a bit of a mentor to me over the years as well. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. I think, Jake, I think we need to do a topic on LGBT specifically. What do you reckon?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was hoping we were going to get some liberals on here, some angry liberals that were going to come on,
Sharif,
but we didn't get them.
Sharif, I would suggest philosophically tying this into realism versus nominalism.
Yeah,
because that's really...
You watched that show on Blogging Theology then.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the discussion. Yeah, that's really the discussion at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And because once you unpack that, you then understand where all of the other arguments come from and why they argue those particular points. And in fact, this whole fluidity of gender is exactly from this realist nominalist argument. It wouldn't exist otherwise. Because once you must establish everything as having real categories, then you open the floodgates to categorizing anything to everything, right? And I think that's worth having as a preamble to then say, okay, one of the consequences of this is gender fluidity, and then also sexual preference fluidity as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good topic and discussion to have. But I think even the categories of realism and nominalism, I think from our perspective, we don't even have to be sort of universal.
No, we don't.
Yeah,
right.
universal, because we're saying that actually the idea of gender is grounded in terms of how we act within the Islamic text, and that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think this is sometimes part of the problem with the debate within the West is that when it comes to the issue of is gender, as an example, is it biological or is it developed? So it's like they have to. So the right has to justify its position by appealing to biology to rationalize how, male are male and female are female. Whereas the liberal left, they say no. There's no connection to biology and gender or sex and gender. So therefore, they say it's all a social construct, and so they go down that route. And so they have this constant debate about nurture versus nature. Whereas what we do is we bypass that, say, irrespective of whether, you know, whatever the biology says or whatever, or the current biology says or whatever, whether it's social construct, this is what Allah says. Yeah, I mean, so that's
and again, this is the point for those that are sort of deeply embedded in that paradigm.
Yeah,
they don't actually know how deeply embedded they are until you demonstrate the internal inconsistencies of either the right or the left position, which is actually always grounded on something that you're not aware of.
So I think what Duggan what he shows is he shows the what's the word, the entailment of their view, that basically you'll get transhumanism, because you won't even have a category called human, you know, so anything could be considered human. Yeah,
and that's the point. So for many individuals that I speak to, they don't even know they're living in this paradigm. They don't even know it's a paradigm. They just think that's the way life is. And it's only when you point it out to them and say, look, did you know this is where you're living, this is your landscape that you're involved in, this is what it entails, they sort of suddenly go, okay, I need to think about this. Or I don't want to think about it. But at least you've demonstrated to them at least a bit of enlightenment to say, okay, there is an alternative though. And the alternative is you don't need to accept any of this. There's actually another paradigm you can move into. But it requires you to first appreciate that simply move from left to right or right to left isn't in itself actually a worthy transition. You know, because you're still in the same capsule.
Yeah. That's
what I'm saying.
Yeah. No. I think it's a good point, and I think the whole topic area is a really important topic area to discuss, because there's a lot of ramification. It's not just about LGBT. It's a whole idea about identity, grounding of morality, tradition, and, you know, sovereignty as well. You know, who defines the right of a person in a particular way, and the consequences of that. So there's loads of different aspects to this. And one thing that I've noticed as well is the fact that it seems to be a stronger pushback now, whether it's by the right or whatever it is, but people against this liberalization, this very much leftist liberalization that's taking place within the world. Yeah, there's you know, what if they want to call it woke culture or whatever it is. Yeah, so there's a really big push, and again, like I said at the beginning of the stream, you know, we're seeing, you know, even famous individuals like, you know, I know he's infamous according to some people, like Andrew Tate, but I'm just saying he's a symptom of this reaction. The fact that he perceives Islam as being the only religion out there that holds on to certain principles, whereas everything else has sort of succumbed. And I think there is a bigger perception now that Muslims out there, and Islam in particular, they're holding on to certain principles. The guy who did that documentary, What It's to Be Like a, you know, What's a Woman? Do you know that?
He
did that video about Qatar. Did you see that video, Mohammed?
I haven't seen it, no.
So he did a very short video, basically criticizing the West, saying that you guys are saying that these guys are immoral and backward, but look at, you can't define a woman or a man. They're looking at you thinking you're backward. So I think there's a strong sentiment that's coming out within the West, which is actually saying, actually, these Muslims have been strict on this particular issue, and maybe they're right. There was a guy that Ali Dawah was doing Dawah to,
I saw that.
Korean transsexual.
Yeah, I saw him. Yeah. He accepted Christianity
have you seen that
recently,
one?
right? Yeah, I saw that one. Yeah. I did.
Yeah,
I saw that one. You know what I would add there
now, and he rejects his transgenderism of the past. Yeah, but okay,
so,
fine. He's got Christianity,
so this is like a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old changes his mind now, and yet you want children to go through this at like 7 or 8. I mean, that's a whole different issue. Right. But at that point, I think fundamentally what it boils down to is this whole idea that many people walk around with, which is that the decisions that I take have no impact beyond me. And that's the consequence of a lot of these things, which is, as you said, who was it? I think it was yourself or Abdullah. They need to be omniscients, or they need to be omniscient in taking the decision, and yet they're not. And because they walk around with the idea that I mean, Brexit is a great example, right? Where in the UK, everybody took this decision on the back of this is the best thing ever for the UK. And yet, less than a year down the road, or a couple of years, 6 years down the road now, and last year with all the change of politics, everybody sort of go backtracking and saying, "Oh, it wasn't such a good idea." Well, okay, you exercised your choice. Do you now not need to live with the consequences? And that's the double standard, which is they exercise the choice, and then when they see the outcome, they don't want to live with it.
Yeah.
Well, you can't. I mean, in Islam, it's like you have the rules, the guides, and the consequences are either you have eternal afterlife of bliss, or an eternal afterlife of punishment, or some such effect. So our consequences are very clear, and the decisions you take are very well laid down, and we appeal to those as divinely given rules, and we follow them. What do you have? Because it changes as the wind changes. And I think for many people floating around, like this individual that Ali Dawah interviewed, they actually don't even know that they're in this fog. They think they're being free and exercising their rights to do whatever they want to do, until somebody like an Ali Dawah or even the message gets to them, and they're shown actually no, there is another alternative. And I think that's part of it. Is we don't need to convert anyone. We just literally just sort of give them a shake on the shoulders and wake them up to say, "Hey, you realize you're in a stupor, right? Get out of the stupor, wake up." One final thing. Recently, I was actually out shopping, and I overheard a couple saying, "I stopped drinking now, except for once a week." He said, "It's amazing. I feel so awake all of a sudden." I was just passing them in the market. I think it was one of the stores, and they were just having this conversation amongst themselves. And so I think this idea of alcohol being linked to cancer and being linked to all sorts of things is getting down to the masses. And some people are actually exercising abstinence from alcohol. And the guy was saying, "Look, I feel actually so much more awake. In fact, I don't even know why I drink." And I thought, wow. I mean, and completely sort of random conversation that I overheard. And I think this, if we take just another 1 or 2 generations down the road, could be the beginnings of people just sort of suddenly waking up and sort of exploring reality for what it really is.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair, anyway, Muhammad.
Jazakallah, thank you.
Inshallah, we'll see you soon in our next stream. Inshallah. So, inshallah, have you got anything planned on Dawah-wise?
We've got a specific session on Hinduism that we're doing, and we're exploring the Varna, the caste system. Specifically, because this seems to come up repeatedly, we're planning that, and then we'll have another couple of open Q&As before we close out this year, and then next year more shorts. I think that seems to be the way to go. So we're going to be clipping and doing more sort of short videos. Every platform's moving to shorts. You can't get away from it. Yeah. So the long
swings and roundabouts. Go short, and then people start longer streams and short streams. It's all
your streams, our streams. I mean, our audience like the long form. That's what they come for. And I think we're not here. I mean, we definitely are not in for the clicks or the subs. And at the end of the day, we're here to get a very specific message across and to deliver a very, very specific process of ideation with them to say, this is how you need to think about what you're doing. So I think the long form for us remains the case, but we need to unfortunately work the algorithm to do what it does, which is get it out to the masses. And if it's short form is how the algorithm works, that's what you have to do. So that's what we'll be doing. And let's see where it goes. And pray that it's successful, inshallah.
Inshallah. So brothers, guys, check out EF Dawah. Dawah-wise. EF
Dawah-wise. That's okay. EF Dawah as well. Check out all of us, right? It doesn't matter. Yeah. Go anywhere.
Check out Dawah-wise for their shows, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Right, Jake. So, inshallah, anything planned on your end?
Well, I posted
Tuesdays.
a link. I posted a link in the chat to a lecture or a presentation I did on blogging theology on the LPT, on the logical problem of the Trinity.
I tell you what, that was brilliant. I love that.
Yeah, so I
even though I've
recommend.
heard it many times from you, Jake, but I thought the way you broke it down in that 4 hour, I know it's 4 hours, but it's just really good.
Yeah, I think especially like the first 45 minutes or so. I don't know how exactly long it was. People may enjoy that because I try to present it slightly differently each time I do it, so people can gain something out of it. So even if you've heard it before from me, I think there's some new information or angles that people can appreciate, especially the historical angle that I present in the beginning. So that's one thing. And then, I started a new live stream show on my channel called Testing the Trinity Tuesdays. So every Tuesday night, I'll be going live at 8 p.m. It's kind of late for UK people, but 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is like 1 in the morning for people in the UK. And I just invite Trinitarians, although I haven't gotten that many Trinitarians on. I did towards the end of last stream, I got some good guests, but I basically invite Trinitarians to come on and discuss the Trinity. So if you know any Christians, you know any Trinitarians that would like to discuss that, because I do a lot of time, spend a lot of time criticizing it, but I want to give Christians a chance to come on and, try to critique my arguments and defend their view. So that's what I do on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. And that will be once a week, every Tuesday. So that's one thing. And then in a couple weeks, I have a debate with a popular atheist. We can call him counter apologist or atheist advocate, Matt Dillahunty. I'm supposed to have a debate with him in about 2 weeks on the topic, does God exist? So obviously I'll be arguing.
We didn't get it done on tap, isn't it?
Yeah.
We were planning to get Matt Dillahunty down to tap. We could have got him for a debate, isn't it?
Yeah. It happens, but
we'll do a review, inshallah, after the debate.
Yeah, hopefully it's decent enough that we'll be able to do a review. But yeah, so in about 2 weeks, on the 19th, Monday, the 19th of December, at 8 p.m., I will be debating Matt Dillahunty on James is Tired's YouTube channel. So people can check that out. And I'll wind up reposting it on my channel later on, a week or so after the debate. But look out for that. Does God Exist with Matt Dillahunty. Other than that, that's about it.
No, alhamdulillah. But yeah, so just to remind the guys, just check out that blogging theology where Jake discusses, because I think the sometimes, especially in your discussions and debates, it can be quite hard sometimes to follow. What's the difference between social Trinitarianism, relative identity Trinitarianism? But you break it down very nicely there, so it becomes clearer as to what the arguments are that some Trinitarians propose, and also what themes are with those particular various views. So, for guys to check that out. Jazakallah khair to everybody who's stuck around. Apologies for the problems that we had at the beginning of the show where we had to redo the stream. We're not sure what happened there. So either there was a technical problem with StreamYard, or there was a technical problem with one of the brothers, not me. Yeah. But alhamdulillah, we're able to start the other stream, and I think most people joined back on again. So appreciate that. So I'm gonna go to the outro, and I will leave you guys. And please share, like, subscribe to the stream. We all appreciate it. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.